Państwo nie widzą. Dziękuję bardzo i right now I like to invite Andrew Kavchak for his lecture. His lecture titled The Katyn Forest Massacre will be in English. There will be some repetition, I'm sorry, but he's going to present based on his knowledge. He's not also a historian. I'm not a historian. I have a PhD in engineering. I have 3 titles, my friend. 3 titles.
PhD in volcanic.
No, not in volcanic.
No, not volcanic? But I was close.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, distinguished members of the Polish Embassy, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I'm aware that on the agenda I was supposed to have finished my speech 10 minutes ago. And I realized that there's also some in our slides some repetition, so I'm going to skip over those things to try to move things along. And I also know that there's some important hockey games on TV tonight that you all want to watch, right? So we're going to get through this. So, the Katyn Forest Massacre. What I'd like to do in this presentation is read a couple of paragraphs from some classic books that explain very well, I think, how Stalin behaved when he was caught with his pants down after the invasion by the Nazis in the Soviet Union, when we were asking where are the Polish officers. And these passages also, I think, will demonstrate very well how good our Polish leadership was and how skilled were our diplomats. So, let me start off first with the question about the youth. There's not enough young people coming to these events. I regret there's not more, because in 100 years, when we're old and no longer able to do this kind of stuff, somebody's going to have to pick up the slack. The problem, I think, when I talk to young people these days, is when I ask them, how did the war start? Even history students, they kind of miss it. So how would you rate, if you were testing students in university, for example, on a test, and asked them to very simply, in one question, as short as possible, explain how the war started? How would you assess this answer? In September 1939, after 4 weeks of valiant but hopeless struggle against the vastly superior German forces, the Polish state collapsed. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate that as a description of how the war started?
0.
0. I would give 5, but no more than 5. I found this at the beginning of an academic paper on the internet published a couple of years ago describing one element of World War II. And I find this kind of answer typical. And it's really depressing. I give it no more than 5 because, of course, it leaves out half of what happened, right? So technically it's correct. And that's why you see this, I think, in a lot of books that history students read in high school and whatnot. I mean, there was four weeks of battle. It was largely hopeless. The Germans were superior, and the Polish state did collapse. So, I mean, technically it's correct. But it's misleading because of the omissions. And at the end, when it implies that the Germans took over all of Poland, that is not just incorrect, it's terribly incorrect. They didn't even take over half, because after the 28th of September, when the Nazis and the Soviets signed a boundary agreement, they made some adjustments to the secret protocols, the lineage, and the Germans only had 48% of Polish territory. The Soviets had 52. So what would have been, like I didn't write this, right? I mean, I found this on the internet. But what I did write is, and I think this is a more complete answer to the question, and I would give myself 10 out of 10. I hope you agree. Okay, so this isn't new to anybody here. Let's move on. officers, you know, most of the officers, Polish officers and reservists were Kozielsk and Starobielsk. My grandfather, Stanisław Kavchak, was at Starobielsk. Ostashkov, over 6,000 prisoners who were mostly police, intelligence agents, prison guards, military guards, you know, important municipal politicians and so on. Next. Okay, 1940, first of four mass deportations. The Soviets got, for example, from the addresses on postcards that the Polish POWs were allowed to mail home. And I found one of the cards that my grandfather mailed to my grandmother. You know, the NKVD got the addresses of the families. And in one of those four mass waves of arrests and deportations, they targeted specifically the families. I asked my father why he and my grandmother weren't arrested, and he responded that they had the good fortune, ironically, in this circumstance, of living in the Nazi zone of occupation and not the Soviet zone, so they were out of reach of the NKVD. So, November 5th, there's the famous memo, and in April and May, the executions. However, of the prisoners in the three camps, 400 were not executed, but sent to the Gria Soviets camp. The Soviets presumably thought they could make some use of these people. Half of them, I am led to believe from some of the literature, were somewhat communist or pro-Soviet, but the others were, and probably all of them, except for Berlin, were Polish patriots. Next. Okay, so here's the best map that I've seen on the internet that describes what happened. And so if you look at the red lines, those from Ostashkov were murdered and buried in Mednoye, those from Kozielsk at the Katyn Massacre, those at Starobielsk taken to Kharkov, murdered in the basement of the NKVD building, and their bodies buried in mass graves outside of town in the Piatki forest. The green lines sort of refer to those Polish prisoners who were held in prisons in Western Belarus and Western Ukraine. However, their actual places of execution and burial are not known. Next. All right, 1941. So everything changes with Operation Barbarossa. June 22nd, the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the Soviets are in the same camp with us, in the same common struggle against Hitler. And June 30th, July 30th, Sikorsky and Maysky and the Polish government in exile and the Soviet ambassador in England signed an agreement which, among other things, allows for the amnesty of Poles in Soviet captivity. This is, of course, an insulting term because it implies they were all criminals, and their only crime, of course, was that they were Polish. Right? The other thing that the agreement provided for was the creation of the Polish army, which ended up being led by Anders, who was released from Lubyanka. And initially, the army started to gather in Buzuluk, and of course, the Poles who weren't in the army but were released were heading to Buzuluk as well. And in the fall, Anders set up a documentation center. This is one of these really important events in World War II where the Poles did a phenomenal job of recording history. One, of course, is the Onek Shabbat organization led by Reinhold Blum in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this one is another phenomenal one where Anders set up a system where the Poles who came to Buzuluk were all asked questions in a sort of a form survey of what they experienced and what they'd seen and whether they were aware of the location where some Polish officers may be and so on. All of that information ended up being very useful for this one book that was published in 1965, well, in English, but at the end of the war in London about the known information about the Katyn Massacre. But I gather that all of that documentation is now at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Now, one of the things that Anders asked was an officer by the name of Joseph Chapsky, who was at Starobielsk and who was sent to Gryazovets, so he was a survivor of Starobielsk. And he and actually the Bolshevik, at the end of the Polish Bolshevik War in 1920, he was actually tasked at one point with trying to find Polish officers who had been captured by the Bolsheviks, and he didn't find them. And he was given the same task this time. And he ended up writing a couple of books. Right at the end of the war in French was Souvenir de Starobielsk, which was recently translated into English. And another book that was Nieludzki Ziemi, which was published in '51 in English, is The Inhuman Land. I've got another edition of it here. It's one of the most fascinating books. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But in particular, there's a couple of chapters here where he describes how he was tasked and given a letter from Anders that begins with, on the permission of Stalin and General Anders, I have authority to look for the Polish missing officers. And he went to Moscow to seek some information, right? So one of the first things he did was he visited the office of the general in charge of the Gulag. And he writes how he went into the man's office and he had a huge map of the Soviet Union with little dots everywhere where there was a Gulag camp. And he noticed that the biggest one was in the city that happened to be the coldest in the Soviet Union, with temperatures going down to -60. Anyways, he said, what about these missing Polish officers? To which the head of the Gulag organization said that he was unaware of any that were under his jurisdiction, that the only people in the Gulag were criminals, and he wasn't responsible for prisoners of war. So he advised Chapsky to go to the NKVD. So of course he went to the NKVD and wanted to have meetings with Beria and his deputy Merkulov, but that was impossible. They didn't want to see him. Instead, they told him that he could have a meeting with General Leonid Reichman. I've got to read to you some of this, because this is unbelievable. Imagine being brought to the Lubyanka at some flights to a room to meet General Reichman. The room had heavy drapes and a carpet. Reichman was thin and small in height, with an aristocratic face and manicured hands. He greeted me and showed me a seat facing the window. Throughout the conversation, a third person was present, also in an NKVD uniform, sitting in total silence by the drapes against the light. Reichman seemed cold and extremely self-controlled. He received me properly, but coolly. During the entire visit, I was not aware of a single gesture or facial expression, nor did I hear a single word that was not calculated. The dry face of this relatively young, balding, fair-haired man did not show the slightest hint of any kind of emotional reaction. And so what Chapsky did was he gave him a lengthy memo, about a dozen pages, explaining the problem, where are the officers, we know which camps they were at, but they disappeared, and the efforts to identify where they may be, and the efforts of going to Kubyshev and trying to speak with people in Soviet authorities about where they were, all of which led to nothing. When he gave the memo to Reichman read each line slowly, and Chapsky stood beside him and saw that he was reading every line. And at the end, without looking at me in the eyes, he dryly declared that it was not his department and that he knew nothing about it. But he had previously had meetings with Anders, and he knew General Anders. So he said, but for that General Anders, he was prepared to investigate the matter, and that Chapsky was to wait. In a few days' time, as soon as he found something out, he would let me know. So he was basically told to wait in his hotel room. There were 2 hotels in Moscow at the time that had foreigners So he was in one of them, and of course both hotels were infested with NKVD agents who knew exactly what foreigners were doing. And he was waiting in his room for 12 days. 12 days. And then at the end of 12 days, he writes this. One night I went to bed early and fell asleep. Suddenly the telephone rang. It was only midnight. Awoken from deep sleep, I thought that it was 8 in the morning. Who was calling? General Reichman. He told me he called me 3 times and was surprised the hotel administration had failed to let me know. He wanted to see me in person, but unfortunately tomorrow morning he was leaving and there wouldn't be time. All of this was said in an extremely friendly tone, engaging, warm even. He went on to say that he inquired into my case and had been informed that all materials concerning the Polish prisoners of war had been passed from the NKVD to the NKID, the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. He advised me to go back to Kuybyshev and to approach Comrade Wyszynski and Comrade Novikov there. And of course, Chatsky pointed out to him, look, we've already been talking to Wyszynski, we've seen him and Novikov 8 times already, and all of this was written in the memo that you read, okay, that I gave to you. So they had a short exchange, and then at the end, to conclude this, Chatsky writes, the cutoff phone call nullified not just the purpose of my journey to Moscow, but also the months and months I had spent preparing for it. I had gained no news at all, and still had no idea if my comrades were alive or where they were. There were no more doors for me to knock on in Moscow in the hope of them being opened to me. As for Reichman, I was sure he was refusing to say anything simply because he knew something that he could not tell me. Now, what's interesting about this Reichman fellow is that at the end of the 1980s, when Gorbachev's glasnost had sufficiently permeated Soviet society, a number of journalists, including this one Russian journalist, Vladimir Abarinov, did some research into the Katyn story, and he came into enough information that he concluded that it was an NKVD operation, and he published a book around the time that Gorbachev admitted that it was a KGB, an NKVD operation in 1990, and the book was subsequently translated into English. And there's a fascinating part here where he discusses how, during his research, he met somebody. Of the 3 generals named by Joseph Chatsky, I had a chance to put queries to only one, Reichman. Leonid Reichman gave me a courteous reception, but he disappointed me immediately. He said he did not know Chatsky and had never met him. On the other hand, he had met General Anders himself, and he talked a lot about Anders. But then he's quoted as saying, apart from the meeting with Anders, I did not subsequently take part in any meetings with any of the Poles. I never heard the name of Chatsky. Okay, so the lies continue for decades. But it's interesting, he claims he doesn't know Chatsky, he insisted on it. One can speculate whether he's, perhaps he forgot, or perhaps he's deliberately lying. But Barinov stayed with Reichman for a while and discussed a lot of, what Reichman did before the war and during the war. And what Barinov concluded was that Reichman possessed a phenomenal memory. Okay, next. Okay, so after the war, the agreement between Sikorsky and Maysky was made, and relations were established between the Polish government in exile and the Soviet government, the Sikorsky appointed Ambassador Stanisław Kot to be the ambassador in the Soviet Union. Now, Kot didn't speak Russian, so every time he had meetings with Russian Soviet officials, he brought with him an assistant who was a translator who took notes, and afterwards they both went over the notes to finalize them and make sure they were as accurate as can be. All of these memos of all these meetings were subsequently published in Polish and then published in English. There's a couple here that are very relevant to the Katyn story, and I'd just like to mention quickly two of them. The first one being from November. There was one before with Wyszynski that's phenomenal, but in the interest of time, I'll just speak about these two meetings with Molotov and Stalin. The first one was in the end of, it was November 14th, 1941. So Ambassador Katyn was meeting in the Kremlin with Molotov and Stalin in order to prepare for Sikorsky's visit, which was expected on December 3rd. So throughout the meeting, they discussed many things, but I'll just focus on a couple of paragraphs regarding the Katyn, Polish officers. So this is written in the style of a theater play, identity of who's speaking and who said what. So cut. I have already taken up much of your time, which is occupied with highly important matters, but I have one other question I would like to raise. Stalin, affably, says, by all means, Mr. Ambassador. Cut says, you are the author of an amnesty for Polish citizens in the USSR. You made that gesture, and I should be very grateful if you would bring influence to bear to ensure that it would be carried out completely. And Stalin asks, are there still Poles not yet released? And Cut says, I still have not seen one officer from the camp in Starobiaz, which was dissolved in the spring of 1940. Stalin says, I shall go into that. But all sorts of things happen to the released people. What was the name of that commander from the Luftdefense? General Langner, if I'm not mistaken. Now, those of you who recall, when the Soviets surrounded Lvov, the Poles made an agreement to the Soviets that they would be released and they would be permitted to go to whatever country would accept them. Instead, the Soviets, as soon as the Poles gave up, arrested the officers, and Jan Langner, who was the head, managed to escape. So here Stalin is trying to suggest that, well, one of your guys escaped. So maybe they all escaped, right? So Stalin says, yes, Langner, we released him long ago last year. We brought him to Moscow and talked with him, but then he fled abroad, possibly to Romania. Our amnesty provides no exceptions, but the same thing may have happened to certain other military individuals. And then a few moments later, Cut says, and so I asked for an order to be issued that the officers whom we need for the organization of the army are to be released. We have details of when they were transferred from the camps. And Stalin again asks, do these lists exist? All the names are, Cut says, all the names are registered with the Russian camp commanders who summon all the prisoners to roll call every day. In addition, the Narkom Vutyel, which is the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, interrogated each man separately. Not one officer on the staff of General Anders' army, which he commanded in Poland, has been handed over. Now, at this point, Stalin, for a minute or two, has been pacing slowly up and down by the table. Suddenly, he goes swiftly to the telephone on Molotov's desk and connects with the Narkom Vutyel. But he has some difficulty with the phone, so Molotov immediately gets up and says, this is the way, and he dials the number for him. Stalin then speaks to the phone. NKVD, this is Stalin. Have all the Poles been released from the prisons? He listens to the answer. Because I have the Polish ambassador with me, and he tells me they haven't all been released. He listens again, then replaces the receiver and returns to the table. And he then asks, where would the Poles like to fight in the front against the Nazis and so on. And then a little later, the telephone rings. Stalin goes to it and listens. He replaces the receiver and returns, saying in an undertone as though talking to himself, they say they've all been released. So you see, Mr. Djugashvili adopted the name Stalin, which means man of steel, for himself. Well, where's the steel in this? think it would have been a little bit more appropriate for him to call himself a man of theater, but lousy theater. And then what happens on December 3rd, Cut, Anders, and Sikorsky show up for a meeting with Stalin and Molotov. And again, the account here is several pages long and it covers many things, but I just want to talk about what happened with regard to the Polish officers. Sikorsky says, "But I return to our question. I have to tell you, Mr. President, that your declaration of an amnesty is not being put into effect. Many, and some of those are our most valuable people, are still in labor camps." Stalin is making notes, and he says, "That is impossible, since the amnesty concerned everybody, and all of the Poles have been released." And while he says that, he looks at Molotov, and Molotov quickly nods and agrees. Anders then says, "That is not in accordance with the true state of affairs. For we have absolute data regarding some of these camps and the people who are fit for work and not." The argument that was made was that in many of the camps, the labor camps, the commanders had quotas to fulfill. And if they released the Poles, there was a risk they wouldn't be able to fill the quotas. So many of the camp commanders, despite the amnesty, did not release the Poles, because if they didn't meet their quota, instead of being camp director, they would become camp inmate, right? So what happens, he says, "The government's orders are not being carried out there because the commandments of the particular camps, being under obligation to fulfill their production plan, don't wish to lose their best workers, without whom, at times, it would be impossible to fulfill the plan." Molotov laughs and nods. Anders then says, "These people have no understanding of the importance of our common cause." Now, these people, he means the commandants of the directors of the Gulag camps, right? So he says, "They have no understanding of the importance of our common cause, which is suffering terribly great detriment and consequence." And Stalin responds, "These individuals should be brought to trial." Now, of course, when Stalin says somebody should be brought to trial, it's another way of saying you're going to the Gulag or you're going to be executed. But these people that we're talking about, the camp directors, they weren't very nice people. So Anders immediately responds, "I agree." Sikorsky then points out to Stalin, "It is not our business to supply the Soviet government with detailed lists of our people, but the camp commandments have complete lists. I have one with me here, of 4,000 officers, and he points out that his list is based on memory, so it's not complete." And he says, that they have not been released. So Stalin replies, "That's impossible, they fled." This is just like he said before about Langa. They probably all 10,000 Polish officers fled. So Anders asks, "And where would they flee to? Where would they have escaped?" And the answer is Manchuria. That's it. So the thing about this Anders also wrote a book called An Army in Exile, and he says verbatim the same thing about this particular meeting. But then he adds something interesting here, that Molotov, blandly stubborn, chiped in and said, "I consider it hardly possible that your men should still be in camps." And at this point, Anders says, "It was difficult not to lose one's temper. But controlling myself as best I could, I said, I still affirm most solemnly that they are. I repeat, the finest, fittest are kept, because you are short of manpower. Because of their retention, they render poor service to our common cause." And Stalin concludes by saying, "This will be settled. Special instructions will be issued to executive authorities. You must, however, understand, we are at war." I like very much Anders's comment that it was difficult to control one's temper, but they did. And in this context, at the beginning of Katyn's book, in his introduction, he says something on this point that I think is worth me reading out. One paragraph. Has the embassy files accumulated a massive information based on the experience of Polish citizens in all parts of the Soviet Empire? I had no illusions and fully realized what I was up against. But in order to obtain the results we desired, I had to apply a suitable tactic to restrain our thoroughly justified indignation, to avoid continual disputes, irritants, wrangles, print bricks, and yet, at every opportune moment, to advance our view of the truth in opposition to the false picture presented by Soviet authorities. In short, on no account must I lose my self-control. To this end, I had to prepare for each conversation by cultivating calm and patience, briefing myself on all aspects of the question to be raised, assembling information as exact as possible, not an easy task in the prevailing conditions. So I think after reading these episodes, I have an incredible amount, and I assume you do too, of respect and admiration for Katyn, Anders, Sikorski. Because I know if I was dealing with Stalin and he was playing these games, it would be difficult for me to not lose my temper. Okay, next please. Okay, so here's a beautiful picture. From the right, Molotov, Sikorski, Stalin, Katyn, and behind him Anders, and I have no idea who the other guys are. Next. All right, 42. Anders convinces Stalin to let the Poles go, so they leave. In total, 115,000 Poles leave with Anders to Persia. Anders, in his book, estimated that 1.5 million Poles had been deported in the first place to Kazakhstan and Siberia, and about 1/4 of them were dead by the end of the first winter. So a lot of people were left and weren't allowed to leave. Okay, next. Okay, 1943. Now here, you know, I won't go through all of this, but what's interesting is that, do you remember a gentleman who was captured, was put in a Russian prison, and with the amnesty, he managed to make his way to Buzuluk and join the Anders army. And he lived in Gatineau, and he wrote a book a couple of years ago called Without Vodka.
Alexander Topolsky.
Exactly, Mr. Topolsky. People know him?
Yeah, I know.
Okay, great.
He
Passed away, unfortunately. Well, his book Without Vodka is absolutely wonderful. The thing is, though, at the end, he does mention Katyn and the uncovering of the mass graves by the Nazis and the announcement that they found these mass graves in April of 1943. And what Tobolsky says in his book is actually, he makes one mistake. He says that the International Red Cross then was able to conduct an investigation on site. That's not true. Sikorski sent a request to the International Red Cross in Switzerland, and when the Germans heard about that, they filed one request at the same time. The International Red Cross had adopted a policy that they wouldn't investigate any event unless there was agreement of all the parties, particularly the country whose soil it was on. And the Soviets, of course, refused. So it wasn't the International Red Cross, but the Germans created 3 separate commissions. One medical commission that was always there, Dr. Woods, they were hosts. The other one was, for a couple of days, they invited experts on, the decomposition of human flesh and bones from all of the a dozen or so occupied countries in Europe. And they also had the technical commission of the Polish Red Cross. Now, the Polish Red Cross ended up, one of the the underground that was led by Tadeusz Komorowski managed to infiltrate an agent into that Polish Red Cross delegation. So he was there at the exhumations, came back to Warsaw and gave Komorowski a full debriefing, including bringing many things with him that they got from the bodies. For example, the rope that was used to tie hands behind the back, Komorowski in his book writes that they had experts examine it, and the rope was totally unknown in Western Europe, and it must have been Russian. But they also had a number of documents, including the diaries on many of the soldiers' bodies, the officers. In his book on the history of the secret army, Komorowski has about 12 pages dealing with the Katyn issue. And there's one thing at the very end, after studying all the information, the evidence, and the documents he wrote, we could have no doubts as to the authenticity of the material in our hands. Reading these documents found in the pockets of the murdered men, I could no longer have any doubt of the Russians' guilt. The problem of Katyn, of who had committed mass murder on defenseless prisoners, had ceased to be a mystery to me. From the list of the names of the Polish officers murdered at Katyn, it was clear they all came from one camp, Koziorsk. And to this day, and he's writing just before 1990, we did not know the fate of the officers at the other two camps. Okay, so this is a list of the evidence. I'll skip it because of lack of time. This is Komorowski's book. Next. Okay, 43, the Soviets reconquered the area, like Alex mentioned. There was the Benko Commission, ended up providing the official Soviet denial and record that lasted until Gorbachev's admission. Next. Okay, so April 13th, 1990, Gorbachev, reveals that it's the NKVD who committed the war crime. 1992, Yeltsin provides Valenza with a copy of the memo. Next. Okay. Conclusion on unresolved issues. So number one, there was a Soviet and Russian investigation in the 1990s, but nobody was charged, and nobody was held accountable. No symbolic offer of compensation. The binders with all the documents and evidence that were collected during the investigation, the vast majority were released. However, many binders were not. So the question is, what do they contain? And of course, where are the graves of the 7,305 prisoners who were in the prisons of Western Ukraine and Belarus who were executed as part of this Katyn massacre? Two bibliographies were published about Katyn literature, one by a London Polish librarian in London who wrote in '76 a short bibliography that was enlarged and a revised edition was published in 1982. However, it's just the citations of books and articles, no annotation, and it does cover, though, articles in different languages, so it's not just Polish, but Russian, German, Italian, English, and so on. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote a book, I have copies of it here, which contains a summary history, as well as an annotation of 38 classic books that tell the full story. Now, before I finish, this is the last thing I'll say, since I'm doing pretty good on time. At the end of the war, Churchill lost the election in England. And he told one of his friends, he said, "That's okay, history will treat me kindly." And his friend asked, "Well, how do you know?" And he said, "Because I'm going to write it." And he wrote a lot of it, and he ended up winning a Nobel Prize, which is fascinating when you think about his life, because he went to a British elite school called Harrow, and to get in, you have to write an exam. And when he wrote the exam, he didn't put a word on the paper. He froze, and a drop of ink fell on the paper. But he got in because his father was a British politician, cabinet minister, lord. And who knew, when he didn't write a single word in his entrance exam to this elite school that he would eventually win a Nobel Prize in Literature. But when it comes to World War II, he wrote a series of books, volumes in chronological order called the Second World War. The episode, the volume called Closing the Ring. There's one story here that is the kind of story that you can imagine, and there's nothing like it. So, at the end of November 1943, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meet at Tehran for a conference to discuss the coming end of the war. Stalin was our host at dinner. The company was strictly limited. Stalin and Molotov, President Roosevelt, Hopkins, Harriman, Clark Kerr, myself, and Eden, and our interpreters. After the labors of the conference, there was a good deal of gaiety, and many toasts were proposed. Stalin, as Hopkins recounts, indulged in a great deal of teasing of me, which I did not at all resent, until the Marshal entered in a genial manner upon a serious and even deadly aspect of the punishment to be inflicted upon the Germans. The German General Staff, he said, must be liquidated. The whole force of Hitler's mighty armies depended upon 50,000 officers and technicians. If these were rounded up and shot at the end of the war, German military strength would be extirpated. On this, Churchill says, I thought it right to say, the British Parliament and public will never tolerate mass executions. Even if in war passion they allowed them to begin, they would turn violently against those responsible after the first butchery had taken place. The Soviets must be under no delusion on this point. Stalin, however, perhaps in mischief, pursued the subject. 50,000, he said, must be shot. I was deeply angered. I would rather, I said, be taken out into the garden here and now and be shot myself than sully my own and my country's honor by such infamy. And then, of course, the Americans made some comments that are entirely forgettable. And then he concludes this episode by saying, at this intrusion, I got up and left the table, walking off into the next room, which was in semi-darkness. I had not yet been a minute there before hands were clapped upon my shoulders from behind, and there was Stalin with Molotov at his side, both grinning broadly and eagerly declaring that they were only playing and that nothing of a serious character had entered their minds. Stalin has a very captivating manner when he chooses to use it, and I never saw him do so to such an extent as at this moment. Although I was not then, and am not now, fully convinced that all was chaff and there was no serious intent lurking behind, I consented to return, and the rest of the evening passed pleasantly. Now, this is interesting that Churchill would say that the British government, the people, would not tolerate mass executions, because the Polish government in exile provided all the information that they had to the British ambassador to the Polish government in exile, O'Malley, who wrote numerous memos for the British government, including Churchill, summarizing the evidence, including himself, that it looks like it's the Russians, and yet the British adopted a policy of suspended judgment for decades. And even after the war, they didn't allow the Poles to join them